Let's decorate this adorable Hello Kitty cake using edible images and fondant. Now to start, I have Tylose powder mixed into my fondant. I only use marshmallow fondant. You want to sprinkle a little bit in there, knead it in there, roll it out, let it sit. It's going to set harder. It's going to be so much easier to work with. So I am rolling out my fondant really long. It needs to be longer than the circumference of the cake. I have my ribbon cutter and I'm cutting 3 of each color. I have some floral foam and a ball tool, and I'm thinning out the edges. So I'm just doing half my ball tool on the fondant and then bringing it up to that floral foam, and that way it gives like a little ruffly effect. And I got my cake out of the refrigerator. That icing is cold and hard. I'm not going to mess it up. I'm getting a little bit of piping gel all along the very top, and I'm putting the bottom half of that ribbon on the cake and letting the top half stick out over the top of the cake, and I'm pinching it together and pushing it in. So I'm kind of bunching it together, and I do have a video where I go into detail on how I do this, and I'm going to link that in the description for you. But I'm really adhering that bottom half to the cake, and then I got a little bit of water down, and now I'm doing the bottom half on the cake, and that top half of that next ribbon is overlapping the bottom section of the one above it. I hope that makes sense, but you can see what I'm doing. So I'm pinching it together, I'm bunching it, and I'm pushing it into the cake, and then tucking it in the very back. And I just want to really press that bottom part against the cake so it's not like sticking out too much. And like I said before, I did 3 of each color. So I did 4 colors going down this cake. This is about a 5-inch tall cake, and these ribbons are about 1 inch wide. And once I finished the 3 strips of white, I did 3 strips of light pink, and then I did the dark pink, and then I finished off with red at the bottom. So I'm just pinching them and pushing them into the cake. Again, that cake is hard and cold. I'm not going to mess it up. And then for the very bottom one, I just cut a little bit of that excess fondant off, get a little bit of water down, and then press that down. And again, I go over this in that video where I go into detail on how I do these ruffles, and that will be linked in the description. I just want to take my spatula and press it in on an angle to give it more of a finished look. And this looks so pretty. I'm going to put that back in the fridge while I work on the toppers. Now I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board, an X-Acto knife and a wet paper towel, a Dresden tool, and a little bit of water. And you could see how thin and how thick I rolled out that fondant. I measured my cake, making sure that I printed that out the correct size. That number 5 is part of my favorite numbers PDF, and I will link that in the description for you. But I'm doing my trace, cut, and smooth method. If you watch my videos, you know how I do this, so I'm quickly moving through this. But I traced it onto the fondant with my Dresden tool. Then I cut it out, and anytime you cut anything out of fondant, you need to take your fingers to smooth the cuts and make it look nice and pretty. I got some water behind that number. I'm sticking it down to the black fondant, and since this is a thicker piece of fondant, I need to make a shallow cut first. So I just start by sticking the tip of my X-Acto knife in the fondant to make a guideline, and then once that line is down, I stick the tip all the way down to the cutting board and cut this out, flip it over, smooth it from the back. Since this is going on the top of the cake, it needs to look pretty from the back and the front. And I'm just going to set that aside to dry. Now I have this fondant rolled out super thin. It's been sitting for about 30 minutes. I'm using my tappets, and I do have a video where I go into detail on how I use these. I will link it below, but you can see I'm getting a little bit of Crisco shortening in each cavity, and I'm really pressing it down and then smacking it on the cutting board, and the letters pop out. In order for these tappets to work correctly, the fondant must be very thin, and you must have that Tylose powder mixed into the fondant, letting it sit so it can set up kind of stiff, and that way it'll easily pop out of here. If your fondant is not thin enough and it's not stiff enough, this is going to be a nightmare. So her name was pretty long, but I did that for all the letters, and now I'm using this little cutter to cut a little name plaque. And anytime I cut anything out of fondant, like I said, I'm going to take my fingers and smooth my cuts. I'm getting a little bit of water behind it, and then I'm going to stick it down to that thinner black fondant as well. And before I glue these letters down, I want to get them into place. These are really small, so it's kind of challenging to move these around. That's why I like to use my fingers and my tools and just make sure I line these up correctly before I start to glue them down. And once they are in the right position, then I can take one letter at a time, get a little bit of water on the back. You don't want too much water, because if you get too much water on there, it's going to seep out and make that white fondant wet. And then once I get them down, I just use that end of my paintbrush to get everything in the right position. And then I'm getting really close with my X-Acto knife and making sure that I'm cutting an even black border around this entire piece. And then again, do I even need to say it? I'm going to take my fingers and smooth my cuts. I'm going to set that aside on a 6-inch cake dummy. That way it could dry with a curve to it. Now I printed these out on my edible printer. I do have videos showing you how I use my edible printer, and I will link that below, but I am cutting exactly along this black border. And I made the mistake of cutting exactly around the Hello Kitty, which I didn't love, but I wanted to include this in here and just show you what this looked like. I usually cut a white border around my edible images, but I didn't with this one. So I flipped it upside down on a paper towel. I'm getting piping gel all along the back, and then I have some black fondant rolled out, like about a ½ inch thick. That way I can get a skewer underneath it, so it's going to sit on top of the cake. But after I cut it out, and I'm trying to smooth that fondant behind the whiskers, I hated how it looked. It looked so sloppy. So I started all over again. I printed this out again, and this time I'm cutting an even white border around this whole thing. I just think that the white borders around the edible images just look so much better. And this time I decided to put it on a piece of white fondant instead of the black. Now I have some thin black fondant that I adhered that little bow to with some piping gel, and I got piping gel behind her again and stuck this to the white fondant, and I'm carefully cutting this out. When you go around the whiskers, you got to be a little careful. That's why I'm working in small sections, kind of sawing my knife up and down so I don't mess it up. And then flip it upside down, and I'm taking my fingers and my tools and trying to smooth everything out, because again, this is going on the top of the cake. It needs to look pretty from the front and the back. And then that looks pretty good. I'm going to set that aside on a cutting board to dry flat for a couple days. Now I got that bottom tier out of my refrigerator, and I'm going to stack this, and I do have a video where I go into detail on how I stack my cakes. That will be linked below. But I measured how tall the straw should be, and I'm cutting them to size and sinking them into the cake. Get a little bit of icing down, and then I got that top tier out of the refrigerator. That icing is cold and hard, so I'm not going to mess it up as I handle it. I make sure that it's level. I dabble the cake, and then I patch that little space with some icing. And then I don't want to put a border between these tiers, so I got a little bit of that pink icing in a bag and just squeeze that in there, and I'm just trying to spackle that little seam so you can't even tell. It's going to be a seamless transition here between both tiers, and I do have a video where I go into detail on how I do this, and I will link that in the description. But I'm just trying to use my spatula and a little bit of water, and I'm smoothing this out so you can't see any lines in the buttercream that is caused by the spatula. I'm just taking my clean finger and just running it over that, and there it is. It looks nice and perfect. So I got that little name sign, and I'm getting a little bit of icing on the back in the middle, and then I'm getting some piping gel along the edges. That way the icing isn't going to seep out of the sides, and I'm adhering that to the front of the top tier, and then just paying attention to where that bow is touching that little sign and getting a little bit of icing and piping gel down. Again, you don't need too much. You don't want it to seep out. And then I cut a bunch of different polka dots out in a bunch of different colors that match the cake. I'm cutting some of them in half, and when I do polka dots, I like to do halvesies at the top and at the bottom, and then I do some full ones in between. And I like to place them around the cake, trying not to have two of the same color near each other. And then I'm taking some non-toxic glue and just getting that around the edge of the cake drum and on the back of that black ribbon, and finishing that cake drum so it looks nice and pretty. And now I'm screwing a skewer in the bottom of that Hello Kitty. That's why she's adhered to a thicker piece of white fondant. This way I can get these skewers and toothpicks underneath. Now with the number 5, I can't stick that straight through the middle. You're going to be able to see it. I have to pay attention to where it's touching the cake, and put it in on an angle. That way you're not going to be able to see that little toothpick. So again, I'm just sticking that right in the center of that black fondant, and I'm screwing it in there carefully, making sure it's not going to poke out the front, back, or the sides. And then I'm getting a little bit of icing, the same color of the top tier, underneath both of those pieces, and I'm going to slide these down carefully. Now naturally a little bit of that icing is going to seep out, so I take a dry paintbrush and a paper towel and just remove any of that excess icing that's sticking out. Now the number 5, I have to put it in on an angle, so as I push it down, it goes a little bit over to the left. And again, I just want to take my dry paintbrush and just remove any excess icing that is sticking out. And then, of course, I made some curlies because I have an addiction, and I only use a few of them. Get a little bit of piping gel underneath each of these and stick them down to the very top of the cake. And here is the Hello Kitty cake. How cute is that? So this cake on the inside, the top tier is a 2-layer torted 5-inch, and the bottom tier is a 2-layer torted 7-inch. And I have a video where I talk about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I will link that below. and it feeds 25 to 30 people. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I have ebooks with all of my favorite recipes. I have my signature scratch pound cake recipes, my best doctored cake mix recipes, all of my favorite buttercream icing and filling recipes, along with my favorite numbers and my favorite fonts, so they will all be linked below. And I do have a Cake Academy membership program where I can help you elevate your cakes to the next level. All of that information is in the description. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you're enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is down below. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials, and you can check out my website. And if you want to see how I did a Hello Kitty cake with a fondant kitty, you can click this video next and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. And remember, it's cake, have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.